All right, chapter 2. Here we go. What is culture? Section 1. Does culture matter? Culture happens when humans interact with the world. Everyone participates in culture. Some even help create it. In history, small groups of culture creators committed to a well-defined set of principles have exerted a very large influence in the lives of others, for better or for worse. In the Christian view, then, human beings are, by divine intent and their very nature, world makers, says sociologist James Davison Hunter. Ernest Gordon's To End All Wars is a moving example of how Christians can shape culture even amid unimaginable circumstances. Gordon was a prisoner in one of the cruelest places on earth, a squalid and terrifying World War II Japanese prison camp called Chung Kai. Chung Kai was filthy, disease-ridden, and inhumane. Prisoners frequently died from starvation, disease, overwork, beatings, shootings, beheadings, or hopelessness. One man, Dusty, was mockingly hung on a tree to die like the savior he professed. Deprived of their humanity, the prisoners adopted a beastly survival of the fittest mindset. Death meant nothing, and life meant little more. Gordon, a member of the elite Scottish Highlanders, described it this way: "Death called to us from every direction. It was in the air we breathed, the food we ate, the things we talked about. The rhythm of death obsessed us with its beat, a beat so regular, so pervasive, so inescapable that it made Chung Kai a place of shadows in the dark valley." But two events, according to Gordon, changed everything. First, word spread of a prisoner who, in the name of Christ, offered his own food and stayed by the side of his bunkmate to nurse him back from the brink of death. His bunkmate survived, but he did not. In the second incident, a guard threatened to randomly execute the prisoner serving a work detail until someone confessed to stealing a missing shovel. A Christian stepped forward and confessed, saving the lives of the others. The enraged guard beat the man, crushing his skull. The others watched in horror, helpless to assist the man who had given his life for theirs. A later recount showed no shovels missing. From a purely pragmatic viewpoint, these deaths were a foolish waste. But in the camp, they led to a new attitude of you first rather than me first. Christian volunteers changed gangrenous bandages and bathed hideous wounds. Life regained some of its meaning. Even the experience of death changed as prisoners stopped piling bodies, instead electing chaplains to conduct honorable funerals for the fallen. Out of this restored humanity grew a stunning culture. The prisoners formed a library and taught courses in everything from math to philosophy to languages, 9 of them. They staged plays. Having retrieved 6 violins from a vandalized relief shipment, they formed an orchestra and held concerts. The overall camp conditions had not changed. Frightful diseases still claimed lives. Food was still scarce and nauseating, but the culture had changed. Sacrifice had brought meaning out of misery. Gordon wrote, "Death was still with us, no doubt about that, but we were slowly being freed from its destructive grip. We were seeing for ourselves the sharp contrast between the forces that made for life and those that made for death. Selfishness, hatred, envy, jealousy, greed, self-indulgence, laziness, and pride were all anti-life. Love, heroism, self-sacrifice, sympathy, mercy, integrity, and creative faith, on the other hand, were the essence of life, turning mere existence into living in its truest sense. These were the gifts of God to men." What Gordon described was culture. He and a handful of others refused to accept the environment that had been forced on them. Despite their horrifying conditions, they were able to shape something beautiful. Along the way, they transformed a place of hatred, cowardice, and greed into a place of love, heroism, and self-sacrifice. A worldview that denies suffering, submits to fate, or coldly envisions a world of mere survival of the fittest is unable to explain a story like Gordon's. In fact, such a story would be incomprehensible if there weren't something so profoundly worth living for that even the fear of death could not conquer it. But the message of the Christian worldview is that something like this indeed exists. Whether in a remote outpost of the Roman Empire or a forgotten prisoner of war camp in Asia, the Christian worldview doesn't ignore culture or stand aloof from it. It transforms it. While the assertion that Christianity can positively influence culture seems self-evident, it is the subject of great controversy. Some wonder whether Christianity should have anything to do with culture. Others are skeptical because so many culture change efforts end badly. Still others wonder whether anyone can really change culture to begin with, or should even try to. Maybe we should all just mind our own business. What Christians should do with culture is such a big question that it will take 3 chapters to answer it. In this chapter, we'll define culture. In the next chapter, we'll examine how Christians in other times and places have interacted with culture. Following that discussion, we'll spend a chapter outlining a plan by which we can engage culture faithfully, especially in relation to the difficult issues we face in our own time. For readers who love to look under the hood to see what makes the engine of culture run, these 3 chapters will be an exciting, eye-opening journey. Some readers, though, will be impatient to get to the issues that form the bulk of this book. I understand the impatience, but if we don't understand what culture is and how it can be changed, we risk damaging the very societal tissue on which we presume to operate with a healing touch. Section 2. Can we change culture, and why should we even try? Nearly everyone agrees that we have problems in our society today, and this book wasn't even written yesterday. In fact, despite stunning advances in technology and medicine, most people think our culture has gotten worse, not better. The question isn't whether bad things are happening. They are. But what we should do in response. In one of my presentations, I suggested that Christians ought to try to engage culture. Afterward, a pastor approached me to express disagreement. He was polite and respectful, but still firmly insisted that Christians ought to avoid engaging with culture. Later in the day, he gave me a 2-page list of Bible verses illustrating his point. Here's a sample. Proverbs 1:15, My son, walk not thou in the way with them, refrain thy foot from their path. 4:14, Enter not into the path of the wicked, and go not in the way of evil men. Proverbs 14:7, Go from the presence of a foolish man, when thou perceivest not in him the lips of knowledge. 2 Corinthians 6:17, Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. His list contained all of the verses he could find that warned believers not to walk with unbelievers. Of course, the danger that this world will pull us toward idolatrous ideas and lead us to forfeit our faith is very real. Many people have lost their bearings because they were influenced by others who didn't share their convictions. The Old Testament, King Solomon, who authored the Proverbs on this pastor's list, was one of them. He married many wives and began following their various religions. You'll find this in 1 Kings 11. He began ruling as a very wise young man. He ended his life regretful and confused. See the book of Ecclesiastes. This pastor's point is well taken. Yet, it's a big mistake to assume that culture is always a bad thing we must avoid. As we saw in chapter 1, there are also many other biblical injunctions that call us to intentionally involve ourselves in culture. Indeed, God will hold to account those who see wrong taking place and do nothing about it. Proverbs 24. Even the Apostle Paul, from whose Corinthian letter the pastor quoted, Come out from among them and be ye separate, famously discussed and debated with non-believers in Athens and Greece in Acts. He even quoted from their own poets and philosophers. Paul knew their culture and, in fact, used it as a platform from which to preach the gospel. The Old Testament is full of examples of culture shapers as well. Joseph became a leader in Egypt. Moses started the nation of Israel. Esther influenced the king and protected her people, the Jews. Daniel and his friends learned Babylon's literature and language and attained influence that they used for godly purposes. Looking at the Bible as a whole gives a very strong impression that God wants us to engage the culture. Further, we need to engage culture for its long-term good rather than merely to fix problems in the short term. The prophet Jeremiah, speaking for God, told the Jewish captives in Babylon to stop hoping for a quick escape and instead to seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. Let me illustrate with an odd example. Several years ago, I lived in the countryside where my wife and I were close friends with the family on the neighboring property. One day, as I was leaving for work, the neighbor's dog shuffled up to me whimpering. Apparently, he had tried to take a bite out of a porcupine and got a mouthful of quills for his effort. No problem, I thought. I'll just yank them out. But hypersensitive to his own pain, the dog became distraught and tried to bite me. Not until he had received a sedative from the traveling veterinarian were we able to get him to relax enough so we could remove the quills. Soon the delicate procedure was complete. The dog finished his nap and everything returned to normal. Never again did the chastened hound bother any creature that looked remotely like a porcupine, including skunks, thankfully. From that day forward, he chased nothing but squirrels. Quill removal is a common approach to culture. It stems from reacting more to the symptoms than the problems causing those symptoms. If we can extract a few irritating quills, we think everything will be fine. For instance, some might say, if we can just get excessive government out of our lives, then we'll live well. Others say, if we can just crack down on crime, then we'll be able to flourish. Still others, however, identify exactly the opposite kind of quills. If we can just get the government to remedy economic and racial injustice, we'll be free to live good lives. Lots of people have a quill or two or four they would like pulled from our culture. Some of these pet projects, forgive the pun, include reforming education, regulating behavior, cleaning up popular culture, employing technology more efficiently, fighting for justice, and protecting the environment. The list is almost endless. But what if the attacks on culture are less like quills embedded in the skin and more like some sort of cancer flowing through the bloodstream? If so, taking a painkiller and dealing with surface wounds might, in spite of welcome temporary relief, cause us to miss the healing that's possible only by treating the source of the pain. Just as easy as putting salve on surface wounds, perhaps even easier, is pretending that the something or someone out there is actually causing the problems we face. We can't expect non-believers to act like believers, but if God's revelation in the Bible is the source of truth, we ought to seek to influence culture by living out that truth as much as possible. This is for the good of others as well as for our own good. Here's why. Many worldviews, because they don't have a category for personal sin and guilt, see all problems as external, not internal. If we could stop those few bad people out there from having their way, they think our problems would be solved. Protests calling for the overthrow of the wealthy are a good example. We don't have as much money as we want, they say, because the rich took it. The answer? Revolution. Express anger and change will come. As the popular 1990s Canadian band Nickelback sang in an album they hoped would launch their comeback, what do we want? We want the change, and how we're going to get there? Revolution. For those in pain, revolution seems to promise immediate relief. But culture change takes time. As culture commentator Andy Crouch phrases it, the only thing you can do with Rome in a day is burn it. Plus, if the problem lies within our own souls, lashing out through revolt won't make things turn out the way we want them to. What if, as the Christian worldview teaches, the problem isn't only them, but also us? Well then, we're back to the cultural drawing board, aren't we? Snarling at our problems won't change them, nor will attacking them one by one. Instead, we need to become students of culture, understanding its elements and discerning its underpinnings, so our solutions actually restore health rather than merely stave off the ravages of disease. Let's start by seeking to understand what culture is in the first place. Just a minute. Section 3. What is culture anyway? Business guru John Cotter knows a lot about shaping organizational cultures in the business world, and he knows it isn't easy. Here's the problem, he says. First, virtually no one clearly defines what they mean by culture, and when they do, they usually get it wrong. Second, virtually no one has read the original research that shows why culture, when clearly defined, is so important, how it is formed, and how it changes. This is true beyond the business world in a culture as a whole. We need to understand what culture is and how it's formed. if we want to understand why we should change it or how. According to Professor Kevin Van Hooser, culture refers to everything that humans do voluntarily as opposed to involuntarily. For example, by nature, reflex, or instinct. Andy Crouch's definition is even simpler. Culture, he says, is what we make of the world. The poet T.S. Eliot, in Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, defined culture as that which makes life worth living. And it is what justifies other peoples and other generations in saying when they contemplate the remains and the influence of an extinct civilization, that it was worth while for that civilization to have existed. Cultures are complex things. As James Davison Hunter points out, culture is what gives us a sense of what we should do or should not do. Cultures develop over a long period of time, and cultural ideas harden into institutions. These institutions give certain people status and power, which they use to keep things the way they are. Hoping for cultural change does not in itself change anything. Those who want change must have a deep knowledge of what culture is and how it got that way. In his landmark volume on the history of intellectual influence, sociologist Randall Collins says most of the large-scale cultural change that has taken place was the result of just a few dozen philosophers, artists, and religious leaders who operated in influential intellectual networks. Those who study culture are called cultural anthropologists. Often their work deals with minute aspects of distant cultures. But in a sense, we ought to all be cultural anthropologists so we can discern culture's power in our lives and find ways to breathe life into it, as Ernest Gordon and his fellow prisoners did at Chung Kai prison camp. Cultural anthropologists know that seemingly small elements of culture have the power to define what we think is normal. Here's an example of how a small decision in the economic realm helped create a large change in a whole culture. In the mid-1800s in England, it was important to have cheap sugar for tea. When Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, gave a speech in Parliament announcing that cheap sugar means cheap slaves, people began considering the possibility that saving a few shillings on sugar was putting human lives at risk. In a nation where believers had, a generation before, succeeded in abolishing the slave trade and slavery, largely through the efforts of Samuel Wilberforce's father, William Wilberforce, Wilberforce's words stripped away the excuses people made that led to misery on plantations far away. Wilberforce knew that what we ignore can influence culture just as much as what we attend to. Also, consider what happened during a 6.5-minute segment at the 2013 MTV Video Music Awards, which Rolling Stone said changed pop culture forever. Okay, this is just hard for me to read, so we're going to plow through it. In that short span of time, the once innocent child actor and singer Miley Cyrus sang "We Can't Stop" while simulating sexual intercourse with another singer, Robin Thicke. In previous times, the performance might have surprised those in the audience and merited nothing but a black and white photo in the newspapers. Through the television broadcast and replays on YouTube, though, millions of people read news reports about the event and viewed the performance itself. A line had been crossed, much to the delight of the narcissistic young performer. 2 months after Cyrus's performance, Queen Latifah presided over the first ever televised same-sex mass wedding during the Grammy Awards, accompanied by Macklemore's award-winning rap ballad, "Same Love." By the standards of what has constituted marriage for the past 2,000 years, this should have been viewed as far more shocking than Cyrus's vulgarity. But because it was carried out tastefully, with fully clothed performers and no indecent gestures, the cultural commentators who had a fit about Cyrus's performance were nearly mute about Latifah's. Latifah officiated the first televised same-sex mass wedding, and America yawned. As John Stonestreet and Sean McDowell later noted in reference to this incident, in terms of cultural significance, silence either signifies irrelevance or complete victory. This silence was deafening. It was no big deal. These two performances may, looking back, seem like trivial cultural moments because technology enabled people all over the world to view them, though they redefined what we think of as normal and caused people to believe in and even celebrate something that just a few years ago would have been unthinkable. How do cultural acts like these gain such power? After all, viewers could have seen Cyrus and Latifah as pathetically shallow people desperate for attention. They could have just shrugged and changed the channel, but that's not what happened. And once we understand something about the nature of human community and the elements that make up culture, we may understand why. And I'm going to stop there for a minute. I'll be back.